There are people who seem to exist beyond the reach of ordinary time. Voices so singular, so woven into the fabric of memory and feeling, that we forget they are human. We forget that behind the standing ovations and the sold-out theaters, behind the Oscars and the Grammys and the decades of headlines, there is a woman who has known longing, rejection, and a particular kind of silence that no applause can ever quite fill. What happens when someone who has given everything to the world, every note, every performance, every carefully guarded piece of herself, finally decides she has something left to say? And what if that something breaks the hearts of the very people who loved her most? What if the announcement she makes at 83 is not a triumph, but a goodbye? And what if the life behind that announcement, the real life, the one the cameras never fully caught, is far more extraordinary and far more painful than any of us ever knew? Her name was never just a name. It was a sound, a frequency, something that bypassed the ears entirely and went straight to somewhere deeper, somewhere unnameable. But she was not always the woman the world would come to worship. She was once a skinny girl from Brooklyn with a crooked nose and a hunger so enormous it frightened people. A girl who stood in front of mirrors in small apartments and sang to herself, because singing was the only place in the world where she felt entirely, undeniably real. Barbra Jones Streisand was born on April 24, 1942, in the Williamsburg neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. The city in those years was a place of crowded tenement buildings and salt air and the smell of bread from corner bakeries, a place where ambition was both necessary and slightly embarrassing, where you were supposed to want better, but not too obviously, not too loudly. Her father, Emanuel Streisand, was a teacher, a scholar, a man described by those who knew him as genuinely brilliant, the kind of person who walked into a room and made it feel more serious, more significant. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage when Barbra was 15 months old. 15 months. She would spend the rest of her life carrying a grief she could not name because she had no memories to attach it to, only an absence, a shape where a father should have been, a silence in the place where his voice might have told her she was enough. Her mother, Diana, was a different kind of force entirely. Practical, cautious, a woman who had been shaped by loss and who wore that shaping openly. Diana remarried when Barbra was 7, and her stepfather, Louis Kind, was a man the young girl never warmed to. The household was not cruel, exactly, but it was not gentle either. It was a place where Barbra learned very early that her needs were somewhat inconvenient, her dreams somewhat impractical, her voice, that astonishing, world-altering voice, something to be managed rather than celebrated. Diana once told her daughter that she was not pretty enough to be an actress. Not pretty enough. Think about that sentence. Think about the weight of it landing on a child who had already lost her father, who was already reaching for something she couldn't quite name, who already felt the pull of stages and lights, and that electric moment when a song moves through a person and out into the world. Her mother meant it practically. She meant it kindly, in the way that practical people are kind, by trying to spare you from disappointment. But what it did was plant a seed of doubt so deep that Barbra Streisand would spend decades of awards and standing ovations and sold-out concerts on every continent, still hearing that voice in the quiet moments before she walked out onto a stage. She grew up sharing a bedroom with her brother Sheldon in a small apartment in Flatbush. Money was never abundant. Space was never abundant. The apartment on Pulaski Street had thin walls and the particular smell of old wood and someone else's cooking. And in that apartment, a young girl with an enormous voice and an enormous hunger began to understand that the world would not simply hand her what she wanted. She would have to take it. She would have to be so undeniably herself that the world would have no choice but to stop and listen. There is a photograph, not widely circulated, more private, of Barbra as a teenager, standing outside a theater in Manhattan. She is thin and sharp-featured and wearing an expression that is half defiance and half longing. And in that expression, you can see the whole story of what was coming. She had already begun making her way to the city whenever she could, taking the subway across the bridge into a Manhattan that felt like another world. A world of possibility, of people who had reinvented themselves, of stages where talent was the only currency that mattered. She told people she was going to be an actress. Some of them laughed. That, too, she carried with her. The defining wound arrived in the form of a rejection that was not a single moment, but a slow accumulation. The casting directors who told her she was too ethnic, the producers who said her nose was wrong, the industry gatekeepers who looked at this fiercely original young woman and saw only a checklist of things that didn't fit. It was 1960, and she was barely 18 years old, living in a tiny apartment in Manhattan that she shared with friends, surviving on determination and very little else. She had entered a talent contest at a Greenwich Village club called The Lion, and she had won. She had won, and the prize was a week's engagement, and the people who heard her sing stopped what they were doing in the way that people only stop when something genuinely rare passes through the room. But the traditional acting world did not want her. Audition after audition, the same polite rejections, the same gentle suggestions that she perhaps consider something more realistic. And here's where the story turns, where the wound becomes something other than just a wound, because Barbra Streisand did not choose to become more conventional. She chose to become more herself. She leaned into the nose and the Brooklyn accent and the wild specificity of her taste, and she walked onto every stage as though she had already decided the outcome. The singing career she had almost stumbled into became not a consolation prize, but the vessel for everything she needed to express. Every unmet longing, every grief she couldn't name, every complicated feeling about fathers who vanished and mothers who doubted, and a world that kept telling her she was too much of the wrong things and not enough of the right ones. She was performing at a small club called the Bonsoir in Greenwich Village when the world first truly heard her. The year was 1960. She was 18 years old, and she walked out onto that tiny stage in the basement of a West 8th Street building, and she opened her mouth, and the room went completely, utterly still. There is something that happens when a truly exceptional voice fills a space. It does not merely enter the ears. It changes the air pressure in a room. It makes the skin prickle. It makes strangers look at each other with a recognition that something is happening that they will want to remember. That is what Barbra Streisand did at the Bonsoir. Every night, for weeks, until the word spread and the lines outside the door grew longer and the critics started finding their way downtown to see what everyone was talking about. Columbia Records signed her in 1962. She was 20 years old. Her debut album, simply titled the Barbra Streisand Album, was released in February 1963, and it did not merely chart well. It won 2 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year. 2 Grammys. For a debut album, from a 21-year-old girl from Brooklyn who had been told she wasn't pretty enough. If there is a sweeter irony in the history of American popular music, it has not yet announced itself. Broadway had already come calling before the album. She had made her Broadway debut in 1962 in a musical called I Can Get It For You Wholesale, and though she was not the lead, she stopped the show every night with a single number, a comic song called Miss Marmalstein, delivered with a timing and a specificity that made audiences lean forward in their seats. She was nominated for a Tony Award. She was 20 years old. The theater world, which had seen everything, which had heard everything, could not quite believe what it was hearing. And then came Funny Girl, the musical that opened on Broadway in 1964, and that would mark the moment when Barbra Streisand stopped being a remarkable talent and became something else entirely. A phenomenon, a cultural event, a force of nature in sequins and eyeliner playing Fanny Brice. A woman whose story rhymed so deeply with her own that the performance was impossible to separate from the person. Funny Girl, they called Fanny Brice. Funny Girl, the industry had essentially called Barbara, not quite right, not quite conventional, funny-looking, funny-sounding. And here she was, turning all of it into the most triumphant performance Broadway had seen in years. The show ran for 1,348 performances. She played every one of them as though her life depended on it, because in some essential way, it did. The lowest point came not from failure, but from a particular kind of success-shaped loneliness that the public rarely sees. By the late 1960s, Barbra Streisand was the most recognizable female entertainer in the world. The film version of Funny Girl had made her an international movie star, and her performance had won her the Academy Award for Best Actress in 1969, shared, famously, with Katharine Hepburn, in a tie that the audience greeted with an explosion of shock and joy. She stood at that podium and said, "Hello, gorgeous," and the words ricocheted around the world. And she was 26 years old, and she was holding an Oscar, and she was married to Elliot Gould, and she had a son named Jason, and by every external measure, she had everything. But something was fracturing. The marriage to Elliot Gould would end in divorce in 1971. The years of relentless performance, of never having the space to simply be a person rather than an icon, had taken something from her. She had developed a severe case of stage fright. Not nervousness, not butterflies, but a paralyzing terror that descended on her before performances and made the very thing she was born to do feel like a threat to her survival. In 1967, at a concert in New York Central Park attended by over 135,000 people, she forgot the lyrics to one of her own songs. In front of 135,000 people, the crowd was warm, generous, forgiving, but the wound was deep, and it would keep her off the concert stage for 27 years. 27 years. Think about what that means. The greatest concert performer of her generation, voluntarily choosing silence over the risk of vulnerability, protecting herself in the only way she knew how. She would eventually describe this period. The years after the Central Park concert, the years of movies and studio albums, and everything but live performance. As a kind of exile she had chosen for herself. She kept working. She kept creating. But there was a door she had closed, and behind it was the most unfiltered version of herself. The version that only existed when she stood on a stage with nothing between her and the audience but sound, and she kept that door locked for nearly 3 decades. Then, in 1994, she announced a return to the concert stage. The anticipation was unlike anything the entertainment world had seen. Tickets sold out instantaneously, for prices that seemed impossible for the time, and when she finally walked out onto a stage at the MGM Grand Garden Arena in Las Vegas on New Year's Eve, 1993, the roar from the audience was so loud and so sustained that it seemed less like applause and more like the release of a collective breath that had been held for 27 years. She was wearing a gown, and she was 51 years old, and her voice had deepened in the decades since Central Park, had taken on new richness and weight, and the particular authority of someone who has lived inside a great deal of music and a great deal of life. And she sang, and the room came apart. The years that followed were years of reinvention and expansion and a growing understanding that her legacy was larger than any single medium. She directed films. The Prince of Tides in 1991. The Mirror Has Two Faces in 1996, with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized everything she touched. She became a prominent political voice, using her platform with an intelligence and specificity that refused to be dismissed. She raised funds, she wrote letters, she sat with presidents. She planted a garden at her Malibu compound, a garden that she tended herself, that she returned to between tours and recording sessions and film projects, a garden that represented, she once said, her relationship with patience and with the idea that beautiful things require tending and time. Her personal life, which had been complicated and painful in the years of her first marriage, found a different shape when she met James Brolin in 1996. He was warm and grounded and tall, and their dynamic was immediately different from anything she had experienced before. Easier, less combustible, more nourishing. They married on July 1st, 1998, and the marriage has endured, which in Hollywood is its own kind of testament. She has spoken about how much his steadiness has meant to her, how the garden at their home, her symbolic place of peace, her recurring touchstone, became something they shared, something that grew in the light of a relationship that finally felt like safety. The announcement came quietly by her standards, not from a stage, not from a press conference, from the pages of a memoir, her autobiography, My Name is Barbara, released in November 2023, a book of 970 pages that she spent years writing, and that contains within it not just the story of a career, but the story of a person who has been looking for her father her entire life. The memoir itself is the announcement. The memoir says, "I am 81 years old as I write this, and I have decided to tell you everything. The things that hurt, the things that shaped me, the things I carried and the things I could not carry, and the things I finally, in the last chapters of my life, learned to set down." And then, in the period surrounding the book's release and promotion, she spoke about something she had never spoken about with quite this degree of honesty. She spoke about her relationship with her mother, the complicated, painful, never quite resolved dance between them, and how Diana's early doubt had echoed through decades, how the words "not pretty enough" had followed her into Oscar-winning performances and sold-out stadiums, and still somehow managed to be there, quiet and persistent, in the moments before the lights went up. She spoke about her father, Emmanuel, and the particular ache of grieving someone you never knew, how his absence was not a single wound but a recurring one, how she had sought his image in the men she loved, and in the work she created, and in the reflection she saw in the eyes of audiences who adored her. She spoke about aging, about the body changing, about the voice changing, about the particular emotional complexity of being 83 years old and looking back at a life that is so vast and so public and so genuinely extraordinary that it sometimes seems impossible that it belonged to a single person. And she suggested, gently but unmistakably, that the great performances may be behind her, not with bitterness, not with grief, but with the particular acceptance of someone who has earned the right to finally rest. The announcement that broke fans' hearts was not one of illness or scandal. It was something quieter and in some ways more devastating. The announcement of completion. The announcement that she has said what she needed to say, sung what she needed to sing, and that the silence she now chooses is not the frightened silence of the girl who forgot her lyrics in Central Park, but the chosen, peaceful silence of a woman who knows exactly who she is. She returned to her garden after the book tour, the place she has always returned to. The roses she tends herself and the paths she walks in the early mornings when the Malibu light is still soft and the Pacific is loud below the cliffs and the world is briefly, mercifully quiet. The garden has been there through the awards and the heartbreaks and the 27 years of stage fright and the return to concert performance and the marriage to James and the writing of the memoir. The garden keeps growing. That is what gardens do. What she stands for now, and this is the part the tabloids always miss, always flatten into something more manageable, is the radical power of refusing to be managed. She was told she was too much. She became more. She was told she was not enough. She became everything. She built a career, a philosophy, and a life on the insistence that specificity is not a flaw, but a gift, that the very things about you that don't fit the standard template are the things that make you irreplaceable. She did not soften her opinions to make rooms more comfortable. She did not change her face to meet an industry's standard of beauty. She stood in the middle of her own contradictions, the stage fright and the sellout concerts, the longing for her father and the independence she had built in his absence, the need for love and the fierceness with which she protected herself, and she made art from all of it. Every album, every film, every performance, made from the full, unedited truth of her. She has a philosophy, stated in different ways across different decades, that comes down to something like this. Be so specific that you become universal. The more exactly yourself you are, the more particular, the more detailed, the more insistently individual, the more other people recognize themselves in you. The girl from Brooklyn who was told she was not pretty enough has now sold over 80 million records worldwide. She is one of the best-selling music artists in history. She is the only artist to have #1 albums in 6 consecutive decades. She has won 2 Academy Awards, 10 Grammy Awards, 5 Emmy Awards, a Tony Award, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And none of it, not a single award, not a single record sold, would have happened if she had taken the advice of the people who told her to be less of herself. Now here is where I want to speak to you directly. Because everything I have just told you, every detail of this woman's extraordinary, complicated, heartbreaking, triumphant life is also, in some essential way, about you. Not because your life resembles hers in its specifics, but because the questions her life raises are questions every human being lives inside. Who told you that you were too much? Who told you that the thing you loved most about yourself was the thing you needed to change? Who planted the seed of doubt that you are still, if you are honest, watering without meaning to? Because that voice, the one that sounds like your mother, your teacher, your first employer, your harshest critic, that voice is not telling the truth. It never was. It was telling you something about their fear, about their limitations, about the things they couldn't imagine because they had not yet heard you sing. Barbra Streisand stood in a tiny basement club in Greenwich Village in 1960, 18 years old and already carrying the grief of a father she never knew. And she opened her mouth and the room went still. Not because she was perfect, not because she was conventional, but because she was entirely, completely, uncomplicatedly herself. And that particular courage, that specific choice, is available to you too. It does not require a voice like hers, or a life like hers, or a story like hers. It requires only the willingness to be the version of yourself that is most true, even when the room has not yet gone still, even when the doubt is louder than the applause, even when the garden is just dirt and you cannot yet see what is going to grow. She's in that garden right now, probably. Walking the paths in the early morning light, tending the roses, listening to the ocean. The girl who was told she wasn't pretty enough. The woman who won everything. The 83-year-old who sat down and wrote 970 pages because she had things to say and she was not going to leave them unsaid. And the question she leaves you with, the question her announcement, her memoir, her entire life is really asking, is this, were you not saying? What have you convinced yourself you cannot do, cannot be, cannot become? And what would happen if, like her, you decided to say it anyway? The garden is still growing. That is what gardens do.